How rich you could be in the Middle Ages depended on a number of factors, including your social status, occupation, and luck. The richest people in the Middle Ages were the nobility. They owned vast estates, which provided them with a steady income from rents and taxes. The wealthiest nobles could have annual incomes of thousands of pounds, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. For example, in 13th century England, the average baron had an annual income of around £200, while the richest nobles could earn over £750. In 14th century France, the richest duke had an income of over 200,000 livres, which was equivalent to over £1 million. Merchants could also become very wealthy, especially if they were involved in long-distance trade. Merchants who traded in luxury goods, such as spices, silk, and furs, could make huge profits. For example, in 13th century Venice, some merchants had incomes of over 10,000 ducats a year, which was equivalent to over £100,000. In 14th century Florence, some merchants had incomes of over 100,000 florins, which was equivalent to over £1 million. However, it was much more difficult for peasants to become rich. Most peasants were tied to the land and worked for a lord in exchange for a plot of land to farm and a small portion of the crops they produced. Peasants could only earn extra money by working as artisans or merchants on the side, but these opportunities were limited. There were a few ways for peasants to become rich, such as by marrying into a wealthy family or by inheriting land. However, these opportunities were rare. Overall, the Middle Ages was a time of great inequality. The richest people were the nobility and merchants, while the poorest people were the peasants. However, it was possible for peasants to become rich, albeit difficult. Being born into a wealthy family was the easiest way to become rich in the Middle Ages. The aristocracy owned vast estates, which provided them with a steady income from rents and taxes. The wealthiest nobles could have annual incomes of thousands of pounds, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. In addition to their income from rents and taxes, the nobility also had access to other sources of wealth, such as royal patronage and the exploitation of their peasants. This meant that they could live very luxurious lifestyles, with large castles, many servants, and expensive clothes and jewelry. However, even within the nobility, there was a great deal of variation in wealth. The richest nobles were those who owned the largest estates and had the most powerful connections to the monarchy. The poorest nobles, on the other hand, might only own a small estate and might have to struggle to make ends meet. For those who were born into a wealthy family, the Middle Ages was a time of great opportunity. They had access to the best education, the best jobs, and the best lifestyle that money could buy. However, it is important to remember that even the richest people in the Middle Ages were vulnerable to disease, famine, and war. Becoming a merchant was a risky but potentially rewarding way to become rich in the Middle Ages. Merchants traded in a variety of goods, including luxury goods such as spices, silk, and furs, as well as more mundane goods such as food and clothing. The most successful merchants were those who were able to establish trade routes with distant lands. These merchants could make huge profits by selling exotic goods in their home markets. However, long-distance trade was also very dangerous, as merchants had to contend with pirates, storms, and other hazards. Even if a merchant was able to successfully trade in distant lands, there was no guarantee of success. The markets for luxury goods were very volatile, and merchants could lose a lot of money if they bought too much of a particular good. Many people were drawn to the merchant profession in the Middle Ages despite the risks. The potential rewards were great, and successful merchants could become very wealthy. Here are some examples of wealthy merchants in the Middle Ages. Jacopo di Artevelde was a Flemish merchant who made his fortune trading in cloth. He was one of the richest men in Flanders during his lifetime. Jacques Coeur was a French merchant who made his fortune trading in spices, silk, and other luxury goods. He was one of the richest merchants in France during his lifetime. Quasimodo Medici was an Italian banker and financier who made his fortune through trade and investment. He was one of the wealthiest men in Italy during his lifetime. If you wanted to become a merchant in the Middle Ages, there were a few things you needed to do. You needed to have some capital. This could come from your family or friends and investors. You needed to have a good understanding of the markets you were trading in. This meant knowing what goods were in high demand and what prices they were selling for. You needed to have a good network of contacts. This could include other merchants, ship captains, and bankers. If you were able to do all of these things, you had a good chance of success as a merchant in the Middle Ages. However, it is important to remember that it is a risky profession, and even the most successful merchants could lose money. Becoming a skilled artisan was a good way to make a living in the Middle Ages. Artisans were in high demand, and they could earn a good wage for their work. Some of the most skilled artisans, such as goldsmiths and masons, could become very wealthy. To become a skilled artisan, you needed to undergo a long apprenticeship. Apprenticeships typically lasted for 7 years, and during that time, you would learn the trade from a master artisan. Once you had completed your apprenticeship, you could become a journeyman artisan. Journeyman artisans worked for other artisans, and they were typically paid on a piecework basis. If you were a skilled artisan, you could eventually become a master artisan. Master artisans owned their own workshops and employed their own apprentices and journeymen. Master artisans could earn a very good living, and some of them became very wealthy. Here are some examples of skilled artisans who became wealthy in the Middle Ages. William Caxton was an English printer who made his fortune printing books. He was the first person to introduce the printing press to England. Andrea del Sarto was an Italian painter who made his fortune painting frescoes and portraits. He was one of the most famous painters of the Renaissance. Hans Holbein the Younger was a German painter and printmaker who made his fortune painting portraits and religious works. He was one of the most famous artists of the Northern Renaissance. If you wanted to become a skilled artisan in the Middle Ages, there were a few things you needed to do. You needed to have a good eye for detail and a steady hand. You needed to be willing to learn and to work hard. You needed to be able to follow instructions carefully. You needed to be able to work independently and as part of a team. If you were able to do all of these things, you had a good chance of becoming a successful artisan in the Middle Ages. However, it is important to remember that it was a demanding profession, and it took years of training and experience to become a skilled artisan. Marrying into a wealthy family was another way to become rich in the Middle Ages. This was a relatively easy way to become rich, but it was not always possible to find a wealthy spouse. For women, marrying into a wealthy family was often the only way to become rich. Women were not allowed to own property or to work in many professions, so they were dependent on their husbands for their financial support. For men, marrying into a wealthy family could be a way to advance their careers and to gain access to power and influence. Many wealthy families were also politically powerful, so marrying into one of these families could give a man a significant boost in his career. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a French queen who married 2 kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England. She was one of the richest women in Europe during her lifetime. Isabella of France was an English queen who married Edward II of England. She was known for her extravagance and her love of luxury goods. Margaret of Anjou was a French queen who married Henry VI of England. She was one of the most powerful women in England during her lifetime. If you wanted to marry into a wealthy family in the Middle Ages, there were a few things you needed to do. You needed to be from a good family yourself. Wealthy families were only interested in marrying their children off to other wealthy families. You needed to be attractive and intelligent. Wealthy families wanted their children to marry spouses who would be good partners for them and who would reflect well on the family. You needed to be able to offer something to the marriage. This could be your own wealth, your political connections, or your social status. If you were able to do all of these things, you had a good chance of marrying into a wealthy family in the Middle Ages. However, it is important to remember that it was not always possible to find a wealthy spouse, and even if you did, there was no guarantee of happiness in the marriage. It is also important to note that, while marrying into a wealthy family was a way to become rich, it was not the only way. Many people became rich through their own hard work and determination. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos.